everybody and welcome to Masterclass. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a beautiful little detailed paw pad made out of Sculpey. You can make it out of polymer clay that you can add to your bears and your art doll animals, and I'm going to show you how to make it up, make the prototype, and then how to take a mold of it so that you can very easily create the same little paw pads over and over again. Now you can make them for the feet of your bears. This is little Oliver's foot here. You can make a paw pad that suits this. I'm going to be making one for his actual arm. So I've got a little Oliver arm made up here, and I'm going to be creating a paw pad that we can make over and over again. Now it's really useful for if you're making a lot of bears or animals that are all about the same size. It's so quick and easy once you've got that mold, and I really recommend that you make them up in a few sizes. So I'm using Apoxie Sculpt, and I think even if you are going to be making your initial prototype that we're going to make the mold from and make the mold out of polymer clay, I think that the actual foot pads themselves that you're going to sew on to your finished product are best made in Apoxie Sculpt, and also you can colour them up with paint first. It makes it so much easier, and they're much stronger for when you go to sew them on. So basically we create them so that they can be sewn on almost like a button. It's very clever, and but you'll find it's very easy. So I have got, first of all, it's my Apoxie Sculpt. I've got that all mixed up, my two parts there, and I have taken my Oliver paw pad and found a wooden disc or a circle, something like that, to determine around about the space I have available to make a little paw detail. So I'm going to allow for that seam allowance there, and it's about 30 millimeters. So I've just traced that on a piece of cardboard. I've got my silicone baking paper here. I'm going to put that underneath, and that just gives me a great guide. So it's just made up, the first prototype is made up very simply in that we have a base section, which is the largest part of the foot pad, and we want to keep everything as even as we can. We don't make left and right, we make them just straight. It's the easiest way to do it. And so I'm just rolling that into a nice little ball there, and then I'm going to get a bit of an oval shape to it. And these can be as thick or as flat as you like, and of course all different sizes. It's quite amazing what you can do with them, and you can also make some amazing colours. So I'm going to start by adding that little first part. So that's the main base of our paw pad. Pop that down there, and I'm going to try and create just a little bit of a point going up. So I'm sculpting from the side here, so I'm going to have a little look at that myself, make sure I'm getting that the right shape. Pop that one back there. So that's the basis for my paw pad. Now I want to add 4 toes. Making it in Apoxie Sculpt is much easier because it's so strong and it's quite sticky, because there really is a glue clay, if you like. So these pieces will stay together better. So what I like to do is create the next 2 toes to go on, but you want to make sure that you've got 2 toes that are exactly the same size. So roll those out and have them next to each other. And then we also do 2 outer toes which are slightly smaller. So this first stage is just creating a shape that we then take a mold of. So I'm just comparing those 2. I need a little bit more on there, because all of your detailing is done when you actually fill the mold, pop them out, ready for actually curing each little piece. So let's have a look there. That's looking a lot better. Pull that one down. and making that little oval shape again. And I just want to add that to the top. I'm going to be mindful of keeping in that circle, not extending too far out. And also Apoxie Sculpt is great for this because there's no shrinkage. It cures just exactly as you made it, whereas some polymer clays do shrink in the oven. It's usually only 1 or 2%, but it can make a difference there. So I'm just going to pull that to where I can really look over it again. Check that I'm getting it nicely centered. There we go. So now I'm going to add the 2 little toes either side. And it's quite amazing to have a whole set of these little molds that you can refer to at any time. And when I have leftover Apoxie Sculpt, I can just make a few little foot pads and store them away. It's just great. So I'm going to go with that size. So there you can see I've just added those 2 little toes either side, and now I've just squeezed everything all in together, keeping everything nice and straight and lined up. And that is the basis of our foot pad. Now when we actually press those out and make a mold and pull those out, we will be adding little holes and different little thread lines in there for us to be able to stitch those on. Good afternoon, Jeremiah. So that is what we're going to do. Now we just leave that now, and that's going to cure. And he's very loud today, isn't he? And then we're going to be making a mold. So to make our mold, when we come back, you're going to need a little shallow lid, something like that. This one is actually much bigger than I need for this foot pad, but that's fine. That's what I'm going to use. I'm going to be filling that a little way up with Apoxie Sculpt, and we'll be taking that impression there. So just something like this. If you're going to be using polymer clay to make your mold, remember you'll need your little lid to be made of metal so that it can go in the oven. Remember, it's got to go in the oven. So just have that one ready. We're going to let that one cure, and then we're going to come back and I'll show you how to take an impression of that. Now we're going to continue on with creating our sculpted foot pad. It's been overnight and I've got a nice firm piece there. So that's totally firm. So what we're going to do, first of all, we're going to take a piece of extra strong thread and we're just going to go in from behind. You should have spaces in between those toes right on the base there. We just take our thread through. We're just trying to create a little handle, back through again. I've got those tail ends hanging there. When I add this to my clay to make my mold, I need to be able to pull it out. So that's how I do that, and it's not going to affect the imprint of the mold. So I've got that already. You can also see that I've got my Apoxie Sculpt, my 2 parts I've mixed together, and I've just dropped that into my little lid that is suitable for mine here. Again, this is much bigger than I need, but that's okay, that's what I have. You can do this is Apoxie Sculpt, you can do this in polymer clay, Sculpey Fimo, but just remember that that lid, that receptacle has to be metal because of course it's going to go in the oven. You also have to remember that with polymer clay, they do have a tiny bit of shrinkage in the oven, and some more than others. It's not usually more than 2%, so it's nothing you have to really worry about because it doesn't matter if this foot pad ends up 2% smaller. If you're doing anything really exact though, pieces fitting together, always remember that Apoxie Sculpt does not change when it cures. So now I've got my talcum powder, and I'm just going to dust the top of that, and I'm going to press that section flat, just as flat as I can make it. And we're going to make an imprint of our paw pad. So first of all, I really want to add some talc to the back of that. And this is just mixed up right now. So you need it freshly mixed so it's nice and soft. And then I'm going to add talcum powder all over my foot pad, especially in those crevices, so that we can make a nice imprint without it sticking. A bit of talcum powder won't affect your imprint. So now I've got my threads to hold that on, and all I'm going to do is push that one straight into that clay. Important to press it in nice and straight and not be wiggling at either side, because that'll stretch it out either side. You want to go in absolutely straight. When you get it to where you think it's about level, I also like to make sure that I've pulled in those edges, not so much to cover it, because remember you've still got to pull that out, but just enough to bring those edges in to keep that shape true, especially in between those toes. So it doesn't need to be perfectly flat. It just has to be the exact pulled in shape around your foot pad. You can see what I mean. I'm bringing all those edges in. This is a mold that you'll have forever. So take a bit of time to get it absolutely right. And do make sure that you haven't got one side pushed in further than the other. And once you're happy with that, have a good look at it. Once you're happy with that, you want to get those threads and pull that straight out. There we go. So your edges are nice and clean, which means that when we add our clay to create extra little paw pads, it's all nice and sharp and clean on those edges. So again, we're going to leave that to cure overnight. Then we're going to come back and actually create the paw pads that we're going to be using. Okay, so now we're back and we're ready to actually create our paw pad that we're going to use and sew in. This has cured, our mold has cured, and the first thing I'm going to do is fully dust that mold with the inside of that mold with my talcum powder, particularly on those edges, because we don't want our clay catching. So I've got a couple of other things ready. I have some sculpting tools ready, something that will make a little hole. We need to make some stitching holes. Also, you may want to grab an old needle or something that's a nice point like that. We're going to be needing that. Now also, for actually curing your paw pad once you've pressed it out, this is made flat. So our original mold and what that one is has a flat back. Now we're making these to sew on to little animal stuffed paw pads and feet, and they are of course curved. So if we curve it as we cure it, they're going to fit a whole lot better. In fact, I would never add them flat backed like that. So what I've done is, because I'm using Apoxie Sculpt, I've just wrapped some silicone paper around an aerosol can. So that's all ready to go. So once I've got my paw pad all done and ready, I will pop it over that and I will be able to press it into that little curved shape on the back. If you're making yours out of polymer clay or Sculpey or something like that, which you totally can, you'll need to create a tin, something that can go in the oven. Perhaps it's some kind of a baking tin, a nut roll tin or something like that. Cover it with your silicone paper ready to pop your polymer clay foot pad on, and then it can go in the oven like that, and then it will also cure with that nice curved shape. So our next step is to get our clay ready. Now what I've done here is I've mixed up my Apoxie Sculpt ready. I've split it into two pieces and I've coloured up one in a dark brown colour, a nice warm brown, and then the rest in a nice warm beige. When I make very realistic dogs where their paw pads are exposed, you'll often find that real dogs have paw pads that are sort of a marbled effect. It's usually a deep liver colour brown with a kind of a salmony pink. Some other dogs have predominantly salmon pink paw pads, so you can really work with that realism. On the other side of the spectrum, of course, you could work bright glitters into these. You could make beautiful, funky, colourful paw pads for your bears. So it all depends on what your project is. I'm just going to be adding this to a little sample arm to show you, which is sort of that beigey blonde colour. So I'm just showing you the technique of blending those two colours together. So when you've got your ball of one colour, your ball of another, you gently wind and blend them, but you don't over blend them. So it's like making marbled icing, really, and you end up with a nice sort of a little pattern there. Now I've got my mould already talked up, ready to go. I'm careful not to get any talcum powder in or on my ball of clay. So I'm going to choose what I want the front to look like. So I'm going to put that section there. You have to estimate your ball of clay to be about the same size as the amount you used to make that mould. So now I'm just going to press that in. Now a good note to remember is don't use freshly mixed up clay. Let it cure a little bit first until it's at that sort of a leather-like consistency, and then you don't have as many problems with pulling it out of the mould and it distorting. So it's sort of a quarter way cured at the moment that I'm using it, which is really good. It's actually good that you can press it in at this stage of the curing process, because it means if you are working on a doll's nose or something like that, you can do all that, you can put it aside for a little bit, finish what you're doing, and then quickly punch out a couple of paw pads with your moulds that you've got sitting here. Then you've got absolutely no waste at all. So you can see that I'm working it into every corner of the mould. And it's not too sticky. It's still a little bit of a mission to pop it out. And you want to also make sure that you've got it even both sides. Now if you have a little divot in the centre that is a little concave, that's absolutely fine. And it's probably much better than it being bulbous this way, because we're going to be curving that paw pad, so that's going to work with us. So I just want to make sure that I've got that whole little shape happening right, and it's all tucked in well. So my next step is that I'm going to pop that one out. So I want to just get a little bit of talc on my needle, and I'm going to dive my needle into the thickest part of my paw pad, which is the lower part. I've put my needle in, I'm going to cover it with my finger, and we just have to gently ease that out. Try not to be distorting it as you're doing that. It can seem daunting. It will lift out, and we can reconstruct it once we've got that out. So you can see if you did this when the clay was freshly mixed, it would just be too soft. So there we go, we've got our little paw pad, and I could have even let that cure even a little bit more. So there we go, there's my basic paw pad. So now I want to press it down flat initially, and any little creases or any little cracks that you have running through just makes it more realistic, because they certainly have texture on them, dogs and bears' paws. So there we go, that's my basic little paw pad there. But what we have to create, of course, are some nice stitching holes. So what I'm going to do is get a little bit, you notice I'm not using water with this one. I'm actually using talcum powder. This will all wash off. So my stitching points are going to be in between the toes. So I'm just going in there with each one, right on the base there. And you have to remember, you've got to be able to get a needle and some doubled extra strong thread through that. So they actually have to be quite large, those holes. So I start small and then I just encourage them to be a little bigger. Now this is a fairly small paw pad, so when I go to stitch it on, you've got to think of it like a button. So my threads are going to go over here, they're going to go over here and over here, so they're going to be holding that paw pad on, and then they're going to be over here at the edges, so they're going to hold down on the sides here. It's really simple to sew them on. If you're making a much bigger paw pad, you may want to add from one of your side holes there a little cavity with your needle, sculpt it in either side, that's similar to this, that gives you a little pathway for your threads to lay, to hold that back section down. But with a little paw pad like this, I don't need to worry about that. It doesn't need to be that big. So now I'm going to enlarge these holes even more. And this, because we've let it cure for a little bit, it's certainly handling any of this extra work really well without distorting. So your little thread channels are already done because of the way we made this piece. So there's your thread channels. Your thread's going to sit in there nicely and it's not going to move, it's not going to slip, and likewise down here. I also like to come in from behind. You see that those holes haven't gone all the way through. You can definitely, with Apoxie Sculpt, you can drill them through when the piece is cured, because you can definitely drill Apoxie Sculpt, but I just find it easier to go back and front. You see that that paw pad is holding itself really well. And that's about it. So that's about all I need to do. You can see right through those holes there. That's my little paw pad done. And how great does all that marbling look? Once it's all fully cured, we're going to wash them so we can scrub all of that talcum powder off. That'll all come off. But for now, we're going to set it into place. You could texturize it if you want to, add more texture. But now I'm just going to add a little bit of talcum powder to my tin there, and I'm just going to push those edges over, and I'm really going to mold that in to that little curve shape. So it needs to be a fairly prominent curve, because of course your teddy bear's foot isn't always absolutely enormous. So you've got to think about the item you're going to be sewing it onto. So you can see that I've curved that over. Now the back of that, it's got a lovely curve to it. So I'm just going to sit that there, and normally I would have 4 little foot pads done all at the same time, all lined up there, which would allow me to check them all, make sure they're all pretty much the same. And then I will just leave that there to cure. I'll keep checking it as it's curing, making sure that it's staying pushed down, and then we will come back and I will show you how we clean it up and how we actually add it to our animal. So here is our completed paw. Now that one's completely cured. You want to make sure that the holes that you have ready to stitch through, that they're nice and clear of any debris and anything like that. You can go through with a very small drill bit if you like, or perhaps just a circular file, just to make sure they're all nice and clean and that needle's going to pass through well. You can, of course, add a coat of matte or gloss varnish on these. I often use a matte varnish, so it really doesn't look any different to that. I find that with the Apoxie Sculpt, it's a great finish just as it is. I like that matte finish. With this particular coloured fur, it looks more natural, but of course you could gloss them up any way you like. So our next step, of course, is just to add it to our limb, whether it be an arm or a foot. You want to make sure that it's positioned well, that you've got room on either side, and it's nicely placed at the end of that limb, and it's on the right angle. So now I'm just going to drop my pins through to keep that in place. Now these paw pads are not intended for adding to a foot pad that has been stitched in felt and then adding this to it. It's not for that at all. That would look quite odd. This is for embedding in fur, and that fur becomes a part of it, and we can bring that fur out all around it. It's for a more realistic look. So we're starting with, I use a medium-sized doll needle just because it's much easier to manage. I've got a decent knot on the end, and what I'm going to do is start on the opposite side, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to endeavour to come out on my first hole there. So you can pull that one out and bring your needle through. It's easier to find than you might think. You see that's gone straight through there, and pull your thread all the way through. Now on the other side, we want to sink that knot into the hole. I'm just pulling my threads through there. So I'm just going to enlarge that hole a little so that I can do that and pop that knot through. There we go, and that should hold nicely. Make sure your pins stay in place, and we're going to stitch straight over the top here. So we're going to go back in right on the edge of that little channel there and come out just somewhere centrally at the back of the paw. Try and make sure that your threads are going in, not twisted. And I'm using a colour that imitates the fur, because that way it looks like it's little fur pieces that are tucked between the paw pad there. Do make sure that you pull independently on each of those threads each time. And that one's nicely anchored in place. Next step is we're going to move to this one. So we're going to go back into that same hole so that nothing shows on this side of the paw. You want to really keep up this tension. And now we're going to come out through the centre hole. And again, pull that one all the way through. Again, making sure that I'm independently pulling on each of those threads. And we're going to dive in right at the top of that channel, again coming out central at the back of that paw. Try and keep those threads from twisting. And really pull those in. My next step, I'm going to go back into the same hole I just came out of, and I'm going to come out through this hole. So you can see I've laid that double stitch the same way. I've gone in, so now I'm at the back here. So now I'm going to come back in through that hole. I want to come out of this hole and down through that channel there. That's going to anchor the side down. So I find my position. I'm keeping that tension up the whole time, and I'm going to come back out through this hole. Every time pulling on those threads. independently. And then we're going into the side here, and you want to aim your needle to come out across closer to this side, because then we need to come in this hole and stitch this side down. After you've done a few of these, you'll find they're very straightforward. Such a great effect. There we go. So that's got that side anchored. Now I'm going to go back into this hole again. And I'm going to come out this one. Pull on those threads. I'm going to dive in this side. Really pull that in. There we go. So that's our foot pad all stitched nicely into place. Now I'm using extra strong thread. You can use an upholstery thread, a nylon thread, a linen thread will work as well, whatever suits you and your colours. So I'm just going to now cast off at the back here where it won't be seen, hide that knot, and I'll show you how I finish off. So that is my finished paw in place, and I've gone ahead and pulled out all of that fur from all around the edge of that paw. And so that's all nicely surrounding that, and the covers over that quite naturally. You can even go in and colour the backing fabric around with some of your alcohol markers and really settle that paw pad in there with a bit of shading, but you can see what a fabulous effect that is. And do remember that you can add it to your foot pads on your bear, and instead of sewing in a felt or no pile foot pad, sew in a fur foot pad. So to give you an example of that, I hope you can see this, but I've got my Siberian Husky here. It's on my iPad. It's the only way I could really show you. So you can see there, he's made up with fur, hands and feet, and then those paw pads I've gone ahead and added. I'll bring that up a little bit for you to see a little bit better. And you can see just how amazing that effect is. That's the colour I was talking about, with that really realistic liver and that salmony pink colour. But definitely for use in plush, in working with fur, not something that you would add to just a straight felt design. We will be using this technique moving forward. We're going to be making some little teacup style toy breeds in fur, and they have teeny weeny little paw pads, so tiny little versions of this. So look, I'm looking forward to seeing some of you add these to your bears. You can certainly use this. This is an Oliver arm, so you could make up an Oliver that way. And if you're doing that and you want to add it to his feet, instead of making his foot pads on his feet in felt or some other fabric, make it up in fur, and then you'll just add those paw pads and they will be form matching. Look, absolutely fabulous. I'm looking forward to seeing you use this one. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you all soon.